Welcome. So happy to see you. I'm Josephine Kim, your host. I'm senior lecturer here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. After a brief intro, we'll go into a lively panel discussion, and then we'll hopefully have time for a Q&A with you. So get ready for that. Through today's forum, we seek to find a way forward through the crisis in adolescent mental health. One thing is very clear. Young people are sending a strong signal of distress. And according to the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, nearly every indicator of mental health challenge among high school students has increased from 2011 to 2021. But we know the situation is a bit more nuanced and multi-layered than it's presented to be sometimes. So let me define for you what mental health is, because I know we talk about it quite a bit, but I don't know if we have a working definition of it. And as I share the definition, I actually want to invite you to give thought to maybe any component of it that makes you pause a little bit, okay? So here you go. Mental health, defined by the World Health Organization, is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes their own abilities, they can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. Did any part of that make you pause at all? Okay. Yeah, the part that really makes me pause is this one, in which the individual can cope with the normal stresses of life. I don't know about you, but I don't know how much of the last 3 years we can kind of categorize as normal stresses of life, right? So in today's forum, we'll hear how community leaders, educators, families can make sense of and respond to the crisis in front of us with experts who look deeply at teen wellness from a variety of angles. We hope to offer a more nuanced and contextualized understanding of teenage mental health, along with a new set of responses and hopeful interventions amidst what looks to be a sobering reality. So with that, it brings me great joy to introduce to you our panelists. We have here, first, Linda Jamarman, Director of the Youth Media and Wellbeing Research Lab at Wellesley Centers for Women at Wellesley College. Yes, you're welcome to give respect where respect is due. We've got Lisa Demore, and I realize that their intros are up there, so if you want to just wave, Lisa. Yes, thank you. We have Alicia Moreland Capuia. Yay. And of course, very fondly, we have one of our own, Rick Weisborg, Senior Lecturer here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So my opening question as I kind of move over in the seating, panelists, as we ease into our conversation today, let's begin with just some broad strokes, right? So when we talk about the landscape of teenage mental health, what feels important for you? What's kind of top of mind for you? And Linda, we'll start with you and go on our way to Rick.
Well, as an adolescent researcher who really cares about the risk and resilience of this very special stage in everybody's lives, mental health could incorporate ill health and well-being and everything in between. There's a lot of identity development during this stage that happens offline and online. And in this day and age, there's so much that happens that is recorded and public in a way that hasn't been before in a generation before this all came to be. And so something that's top of mind is I'm sure there's a lot of people who are who used to not grow up in this kind of digital age that has a sense of nostalgia that you wish that it could go back to the old days where everybody was just kind of hanging out in real life on the streets, on their bikes, and without the games and the phones and the pings. But this is the reality of 2023, that it's an ever-pervasive, digital landscape. Adolescents are growing up in an ecosystem that is a blurred boundary between real life and digital life. And I just wanted to kind of give homage to the fact that this is very real to them and very important, this digital space that they live in.
I think top of mind for me right now is to try to manage this tension between talking very directly about how much suffering we are seeing in teenagers and how much suffering they experienced in the pandemic and then the aftermath of the pandemic, but not doing so in a way.
That's the voice of God.
Oh, yeah. That's good. That's a good sign, right? Not doing so in a way that becomes so overwhelming that people become paralyzed in the face of it. And I'll just say out of the gate, we know what supports adolescent mental health, and it is strong relationships with caring adults. That is the single most powerful force. It has always been the single most powerful force. And we are not going to therapize, Rick and I talk about this all the time, we're not going to therapize or medicate our way out of this situation. It is going to be about adults stepping up for teenagers. So I want to both be very honoring of the landscape and how challenging it truly is. And also, I feel a lot of hope about what can be done. And I feel like that's the tension we need to navigate, looking at the hard parts and then also talking honestly about what we know works.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I want to actually start out with a question, because sometimes we start panels and we're like talking to each other, but we're actually talking with you. So I want to pose a question for our collective consideration here today, and that is this. What does students, adolescents, parents, teachers, and families, what do they all have in common? Guesses? They're people. Another way said, they're human, right? So I want to go to something a little bit more fundamental, which underscores a lot of the conversation that I believe that we're going to have here today. What we know for sure in my Oprah moment, that is a segment, is that all human beings have basic requirements. And those basic requirements are consistent wherever you grew up in the world. That is, according to Maslow, whether you have cultural sort of wars about the actual frame itself, what we know for sure is that for you and I to be able to brush up against the edges of self-actualization, we have some requirements. Well, what are those? At the base of that, we'll call it a triangle today, there is food, water, shelter. Then just above that, we have safety needs. Now, many of you have probably heard and continue to talk a lot about the psychological safety aspect, which is great, but there are other pieces to that as well. Financial, physical, spiritual. And then just above that is love and belonging. So these are all of the pieces that are required for humans, of which adolescents are in. They're in that category, right? That these are the things that we know already that we all require. Now, I want to bring it to something that I hope to continue the conversation with you about today, and that is that when we talk about adolescent mental health, we're not just talking about adolescents themselves, we're talking about every system that engages with an adolescent, and that there is a rich opportunity for that system to be what I call, in the area that I specialize in, to be trauma-informed. And what does that mean? Underneath that, that means that every single system has an opportunity to meet a basic need. So here's what we know, and then I'll wrap up, is that if you are a system, person, place, or thing that is trauma-informed, and in this case, when a school system is trauma-informed, what the data suggests is that suspensions go down, expulsions decrease, dropouts decrease. But here's the other piece. Being trauma-informed is not just about the students, it actually also helps the other human beings in the room, the teachers, the other human beings that are attached to the system, the parents. So what we see is that in trauma-informed schools, that you also have an increase in teacher retention. And then overall, everybody benefits because we are creating the conditions for belonging and safety, which, by the way, is very much a requirement for any of us as human beings in order to be able to thrive. It is a right, safety that is, and it is a requirement. So what I'd like to submit to you for our collective consideration is, what would it look like? Can we imagine, and we probably don't even have to, what would it be like if we had systems that looked beyond anyone's perceived faults and only saw need? I'll yield the floor.
So good afternoon. It's great to see everyone. So I think one of the things that's on my mind is I'm very aware of the media narrative that is going on around this increase in mental health problems. And I think there's a hunt for a single factor or 2 or 3 factors that is driving this increase. I don't really think this is a meaningful conversation to have, to look at 1 factor or 2 factors. I think what's happening varies so much by race and class and culture, and what is going on in Lexington with achievement pressure is very different than intergenerational poverty that people have experienced, for decades. And that we have to have this much more specific conversation about the challenges of kids in different communities and how different factors interact. I told Joe that I would talk a little bit about the landscape and what's happening here for those of you who don't know. Around 2010, 2012, it looks like you see this big spike in anxiety and depression. You see girls suffering depression about twice the rate as boys. LGBTQIA kids, queer kids suffering at very high rates, a steep increase. The pandemic seems to have accelerated the rate of increase. Our data suggests that this problem has also gone down some, and that the CDC data is not accurate because, in one sense, because it was taken during the pandemic. It is reporting on data during the pandemic. Cell phones have been held up as the big villain here. And there are people who are saying that around 2012, we have the introduction of cell phones, and you see this increase begin in 2012 across several different countries at the same time. And that is true. But it's also true that mental health problems have been increasing for elementary school kids. They've been increasing for college kids for 40 years. Parents are suffering mental health problems at very high rates. And one other thing that I will just leave you with, young adults are suffering significantly higher rates of anxiety or depression. People in their 20s. For those of you in 20s, I promise you, life gets better. This is like it's a hard decade. But for some reason, the conversation has so zeroed in on teens, not on young adults or on parents or on the systems these people are embedded in. And there's an I'm not diminishing the challenges of teens, but there's an arbitrariness about that I think we should be concerned about.
Wow, thank you so much. Would you agree it's nuanced, right? Can't read one paper and try to understand mental health. Alicia, I'm coming to you with this question. And we're at the School of Education, so I'm going to drop Bronfenbrenner on you, right? Well, there's a 5th level in the ecological systems model that often becomes overlooked, and that's the chrono system. And what the chrono system says, it's not just the familial, environmental, historical things that we're experiencing, but it's really the developmental stage you're experiencing them in. So if I were to migrate to the United States at 2, very different from that experience if I'm 40. Does that make sense? So since we're looking at teenagers today, my question is, in this era, because that's what the chrono system says, it's not about, again, only your experiences, but the era and the developmental stage you're in. If you're in the thick of your adolescence, you're 13, 14, 15, 16, living in this era, right? What are the factors, salient factors, that are really pushing on the mental health of adolescents?
I think it's an important one, and I think that ecological models can be matched with Slavic's sort of social safety theory model, which is a lot about concentric circles and the interrelatedness of multiple systems. But we don't have to go very far. Many of us can remember our own adolescence, and it was really about trying to make meaning. Like, what is this happening around me? There's a big world out here. Where do I fit? And it's consistent with all of the models. So I'm trying to make meaning, and my brain and my body is changing. As a matter of fact, the way that the brain develops is so interesting. I love the brain. I consider myself to be the Robin Hood of neuroscience. I want to take it to the people, honey. I want you to know what I know. And so if we think about how the brain develops, which I think is so fascinating, and it's consistent, is it develops from the bottom up, the inside out, and from the back to the front. And you're like, why do we care? Why is that important? Well, the bottom, for the most part, let's just consider that to be the survival part of the brain. The middle is the emotional part of the brain, and the top, for all intents and purposes, is our thinking, regulatory part of the brain. And basically, from the back to the front is important because what we know that helps to support healthy brain development is our interaction with the external environment. There are external cues that we have to receive that helps us have a healthy brain. The fact that we're all sitting here and not comatose and our brains are working is nothing short of a miracle. It literally is. But there's a huge interplay between the environment. So what we know then is that the real work of becoming an adult is learning how to manage our emotions and to consider others. And it is consistent with the way that the brain develops. Now let's just think about the potential things that can get in the way of that brain developing as healthily as it could. Stress. And I'm not talking about like just regular stress. I'm talking about toxic stress. So I'm gonna give a quick example, then I'm gonna cut it off because I know my time is short here. So I'm gonna ask you to do something for me. Are you ready? Y'all didn't think you were gonna be you're part of the panel too. So I want you to, I'm gonna give you 8 seconds and I want you to spell your first and last name backwards. Start right now. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop. Was that a ridiculous task? Okay, who completed it? Come on.
Oh.
Okay, I want you to see me later because there's some other analysis we can do we don't have time for. But here's the thing is that I placed on you what we call a top brain cognitive demand, but you were in a bottom brain functioning stressful situation. And in most cases, no one is able to complete those tasks, no matter how cognitively supreme you may think you are or are, right? So there are specific things that happen, right, that help us to get, it is a privilege, I'll end with this, to be in the top part of one's brain. And an adolescent is really trying to get there. It's like, you don't wanna just, survival is a low bar. Operating in your emotions and being led by your amygdala is a low bar. It is a privilege to be in the top part of the brain, and what we know is that safe environments and safe systems help healthy brains. And we are able to then better make meaning and engage meaningfully in the world that we live in.
Thank you. Yes. Would anybody else like to chime in?
Well, going off of your, what the brain is hungry for in adolescence, peer approval, right? Social comparisons is a thief of happiness. Look what happens on social media. It's the platform that is, it's constantly happening, whether while you're sleeping, when you are awake, in online and offline worlds. And I know you mentioned earlier about the caring adult as one of the key support systems, and absolutely, but let's not forget the importance of the power of the peer. And the peer influence has a bad rap usually. Usually it has to do with like some kind of negative infiltration of risky behavior, but actually peer influence can be a very positive experience and could really help young people thrive. So.
Well, I just want to underline something you said. There was so much there, but the piece about that growing up is about learning to manage your emotions and being attentive to others. I think that's such a beautiful nugget about what we want from young people. And one of the things I sometimes feel concerned about with the wellness, certainly at its commercialization level, it's very self-focused. And this insight isn't mine. This came from a religious a leader in our community who shared it with a friend who shared it with me, and I want to credit it. But I thought that's really true, right? That as we're dealing with so much stress, and it is so hard to walk through the world in many ways right now, we can be drawn to wellness and wellness products and practices when what we know is so good, especially for teenagers, is being attentive to the needs of others, thinking about how they can be of use, being given ways to be meaningful in the lives of others. And so when we think about what we can do for teens, it's surrounding them with caring adults and giving them a way to be of use that they can take true pride in.
Of that. In my class today, we talked about the vagus nerve and how when you walk into a room and a caring adult smiles at you, they see you, they are welcoming you into the space, your heartbeat changes.
That's right.
Yeah. And so that's a huge influence that we can have on daily life. So Lisa, I want to ask you, this word crisis, what kinds of things come up for you when I say crisis? Just call them out. Stress, panic. What was that, Matt? Yeah, lots of kind of heightened, frantic panic, right? And so I think one of the things we need to be clear about are, what are kind of the typical, ordinary types of things that we're seeing versus, what's really kind of a crisis and what really needs our attention and concern?
Well, let me just start with the crisis. Something I feel like we're not saying enough in terms of the use of the word crisis right now and the adolescent mental health crisis. We are in a crisis. One of the reasons is that we had such a surge of need in the pandemic, but the workforce to care for teenagers cannot surge at that rate. It is highly specialized work. Not a lot of us do it. It takes a long time to get good at it. And so one of the things that we need to be mindful of as we think about crisis in this, it's not just that the need went up, it's that we can't manufacture clinicians with 20 years experience to suddenly meet that need, much less clinicians of color, right? This is the other thing. We do not have in the pipeline the clinicians of color that we should. If there were anything we should be focusing on, I think especially hard right now, it is increasing that pipeline and delivering more clinicians who can care for kids from all backgrounds. So I think that's one piece of where I think the crisis language is useful to us to think about how can it guide our thinking as people who work in these fields about what we want to be working on now. Another way to take it is to think about what it means to be a teenager and what it's always meant to be a teenager. And I would say a lot of my work right now is trying to help parents tease apart normal and expectable and typical adolescent emotionality, which is rich and spicy on a good day, right? From a mental health concern. And Rick, you have your qualms with how the media has handled things. My beef is those are often talked about. Adolescent distress and adolescent mental health concerns are often spoken about in the same breath in a way that is both inaccurate and unnecessarily terrifying to parents. And terrifying parents does not actually make them better parents. It makes them more paralyzed, more anxious. So for me, the drum I am beating all the time is to say, okay, for me, here's what mental health is. It's about having reactions that fit their context and then being able to manage those reactions effectively. So if a kid's, family pet dies, we would expect sadness. We do not need to think that there's something wrong with that child. So often, examples like that, I could give you 40 others. Distress is evidence of mental health in those moments. We are not talking in that way. What we're really interested in, and this gets back to what you said, is how do the feelings get managed? Does the child weep? Do they find a lovely person who can cuddle them? Do they put on their sad playlist and cry along to it for a while? Do they take their mind off of it for a little while? Or do they turn to substances for numbing? Or do they tear at the fabric of relationships? Or do they turn against themselves? So I think there's so much important public messaging around not reacting to all distress as if it's pathological. In fact, it can often be a sign of health, and really making a distinction much more on, the level of what is landing on young people and then their capacities to handle those feelings in ways that hopefully will be fundamentally adaptive and even growth-giving.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to pick up on Lisa's point. And again, I don't want to diminish the rates of anxiety and depression among teens, because I'm very concerned about it, I'm very worried about it. But I'm also worried about pathologizing it and pathologizing them. And, the world is a very scary, stressful place right now. And a lot of teens are absorbing what is going on in the world. One of the things we see in our research is really top on the list of teens' concerns, things that they think are negatively affecting their mental health, is gun violence in schools. Climate change is something that's affecting a lot of teens. So, a lot of what teens are experiencing is normative, and we should call it that. And a lot of teens are also developing coping strategies that are going to be very important for their long-term well-being. I mean, particularly in affluent communities, we've been talking for a long time about how a lot of kids don't develop coping strategies. Well, a lot of kids have had things to cope with over the last few years, and that's not a bad thing for a lot of kids. So I wanted to bring out this other side of it, too.
Yes, thank you. Linda, I turn to you because I feel like as a parent, in many of our homes, we're fighting a ubiquitous beast called screen time. And I'm just wondering, we see so much out there in the media about just how terrible it is, the gaming addictions, the technology, blaming it on the cell phones, as we've already talked about. Is it the beast that we need to be fighting? How does it impact mental health? Could it ever be a resource?
Yes.
Help us.
Yes, these are perennial questions for sure, and I want to echo a lot of things that our panelists have said, that there's so much normative development that's happening on screens and social media, on phones, and there's only certain rare cases in which it becomes extremely maladaptive and where you need immediate intervention. A lot of times when people are trying to focus on the negative aspects, it's often an all or nothing kind of thing, like a no gray area. It's like, okay, screens are bad, or either come off of it completely, or there's a lot of guilt about even having any screen time. People are always asking about what is the maximum amount of time, or what's the earliest age I should have a phone, and when should I sign up for social media accounts? And the answer is adolescents are not a monolithic group. Everybody has their own particular vulnerabilities. There could be some people that are ready earlier than others. Some people are better at self-regulation. Some people are better at kind of dispelling just online drama. It doesn't affect them as much. And other people, they're devastated by what's going on. And so it really depends on the kind of parental monitoring that is happening, the kind of peer network, or the positive peer network. So social context is so important, like we were saying before.
Yeah, thank you. Other thoughts on technology and social media?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think it is more nuanced and complicated, and it really goes back to this idea that the way that most of us, for the most part, learned what was appropriate and what wasn't appropriate is we had it modeled for us, and we had someone in a gentle, compassionate way, like, not to yell in a library because somebody said, shh, we don't do that. So there's like functional shame attached to it, like, oh my gosh, and then there's toxic shame that I think is so much attached to screen time. There's so much judgment that happens. It's like, your child is 2 and on the iPad. So what? What I think it's important to actively think about context and what we all required, how boundaries are compassionately set, and how we use things for the benefit, and also explain that all of these things can have, they can have advantages and disadvantages. But I think one of the things that we don't deal enough with is this idea of shame. And I want to go back to something. We just did some focus groups. I teach actually multidisciplinarily and then work clinically actually with families, so that includes adolescents and even children. And the interesting piece is this: when you ask what was the number one sort of concern around the pandemic, it wasn't the geopolitical trauma so much. It was on the top 5, but the number 1 was actually loneliness. And here's the thing, that even before the pandemic, what preceded the pandemic was folks saying that they were lonely. You're in a cubicle next to 20 other people, and nobody ever, it's not like Cheers. Nobody knows your name. And you're walking in and no one's greeting you. And it turns out that loneliness actually has significant neurobiological detriment. That we were not designed as, I'm gonna go back to human beings, of which adolescents are human beings, we're not designed to be alone, to be lonely. We were designed to be connected in an interdependent way, not dependent or codependent, but interdependent. And so what happened with COVID is that loneliness exacerbated. And so one of the things that we saw that was useful, and what the study suggests, is that simple things like greeting people, looking in somebody's eye and seeing someone, how are you today? Welcoming folks, that those are things that help to reduce the sense of loneliness.
Yeah, let me just say one thing quickly about that. So I totally agree with this. And I think one of the reasons that young adults' anxiety and depression is so high among young adults is because loneliness rates are so high. So in our recent survey, about 40% of young adults 18 to 25 are reporting being lonely more than half the time in the last 3 weeks. That is like a really frightening number. And we know it's very connected to depression and anxiety. So I'm reinforcing this point about relationships. It's also one of the reasons I think we need to care for the caretakers. And by care for the caretakers, I mean parents. Because especially parents of young kids are lonely as well, and very high rates of loneliness among parents of young kids. And we've got to find ways. There are family support programs around the country to scale programs that connect parents to each other and to resources, people of different kinds, particularly early in their kids' lives. but throughout childhood.
To try to braid a few things together, I think one of the ways we care for parents also is to give them specific things to focus on and to do. I worry that sometimes the language around digital media or technology or screen time, like it's just overwhelming for them, right? What are they going to do? Like rip all of this out of their kids' hands? That's not probably likely. So when I think about digital technology, I think there's two things that I see as being significantly concerning that give us some room to work. One is that what we know is that teenagers are more vulnerable to norms in their environments than children and adults are. And one of the things I find concerning when I do worry about social media is that the algorithms establish norms for kids based on what they may have looked at or even like glanced at or searched once. And so one way that we saw this becoming very problematic in the pandemic was kids who started to look into fitness or eating changes or whatever, and then the algorithms started to deliver just unbelievable volumes of content around fitness and thinness and ultra everything. And then that becomes a norm, especially when you're not out and about seeing other people, and that norm shifts behavior. So I think adults want to be mindful of what are the norms in the digital environments where kids are hanging out, right? So if it's a goofy dance video norm, like fine, right? If it's a toxic norm, I think that's much more concerning. The other one, and I almost hesitate to bring this up because it's so basic and in many ways very boring, sleep. Sleep, sleep, sleep. When we look at the charts on, I'll do it your way, rising mental health concerns, reduced hours in sleep in teenagers, they map on like almost perfectly. So one way we can walk up to this question is, okay, well, what gets in the way of sleep for teens? Social media or digital technology in the bedroom overnight. There should just not be there. There's no reason for it. So for some kids, academic pressures. For some kids, 2 jobs, right? I mean, so that's another way we can thread this, but I think we can both take a much more nuanced view of screens, digital technology, social media, things that often get collapsed. And then also, I would suggest a more draconian view about and they should not be in the rooms where kids are supposed to be sleeping.
80% of young people sleep with their phones and are under their pillows. And so that's going to be a really hard,
problem.
Yeah. Going back to the resilient sort of aspect of it and the loneliness equation, so it is a public health, problem, the issue of loneliness. And when we've surveyed people about, okay, if you're in a room alone, but you're texting with somebody and you're with somebody on social media, as an adult, most people will say, yeah, they're alone. They're physically alone. But when you ask the younger generation, the Generation Z, people who are in their tweens right now, you ask them if they're in the bedroom alone, physically alone, but they're texting and gaming or doing something with their friends, they say that they're not alone. They aren't feeling alone. And so there's something about that where it could be a very adaptive way of combating loneliness when there are social distancing protocols or when they aren't existing in a community that is accepting of maybe a particular identity that they hold. Maybe LGBTQ youth can find ways to connect with people outside of their immediate environments, getting caring adults, getting caring supportive groups that could really help them see that they are not alone and they have a belonging someplace out there in the cyber universe.
Yes, go ahead.
Linda, question. I don't understand why kids can have cell phones in schools. I just think we should ban cell phones from schools. Am I missing something?
Ooh, Rick's starting something.
I think most of them have restrictions, actually.
I just keep hearing from parents, I need to be able to reach my kids during the school day. I don't get that. I mean, that was never true of my generation. If you have an emergency, you can always go to the principal's office. I don't get it. Why should you have your cell phone in school?
Well, there's the chrono system.
Yeah, the parents are going to protest if they can't figure out if did they get on the bus? Where are they now, the after-school programs? So a lot of programs, a lot of schools have a 8 to 3 ban. Like you put it, there's these pockets behind the door where you put them, your phone goes into certain pockets and then you don't get access to it or you have to keep it in your locker. So there are, some restrictions already.
But then the reality, I see the signs up, but the reality though is that it goes back to the safety piece. You've got shootings have picked up in schools, all these things, and parents are concerned. And we talk about being connected, and so it's like, okay, I have kids, and my son's very clear in high school. Put the phone down on vibrate. You can't really pay attention if you're on Instagram. So, and then quite frankly, we track all of the activities. So I know at 102, you hit like on Viola Davis's post. You need to be in chemistry class.
And it was a good post.
And it was good because she has great inspirational posts, but I need you to be focused on chemistry right now. So we have to weigh it with, we have to appreciate our history, our destiny, but be in our reality. And the reality is that people don't feel safe, and the phone, in some cases, help parents feel a little, whether it's an illusion or not, feel a little bit safer that I can at least reach out to my kid immediately to ensure that they're still alive and breathing. So I think that we have to weigh it with all that. That's the reality, for a lot of people.
No, I know. This is the pushback that I.
Oh yeah,
I get about this. And,
push on. Yeah.
And I think this is, my feeling is parents need to learn to manage the anxiety about this. But I certainly get it.
It's a co-regulation. It's a spectrum, though, right? So you get there, and it happens over time when you can see that, somebody didn't bring a knife today. Or a kid didn't commit suicide today. These are things that are happening every single day, and your kids are trying to find, so it's a lot.
Yeah, and ultimately, we can't control everything that happens in our children's life, right?
No, we can't.
And so, one of the things, even when it comes to technology, is to really teach skills, be a smart consumer. Not everything deserves your attention, wouldn't you agree? If they have a full buffet of food, hopefully they've gotten the skills to at least have some green stuff on there, right? And so we're kind of teaching these skills, and I don't think technology is apart from that. I think we can teach them to be wise consumers. But along this line, I've gotten lots of, pings, please give us some actionable steps. And so I'm wondering, how do we, forge a path forward? What are some actionable things that people can take with them? Sure, why not?
No, well, let me just mention a couple things. I think we're all in agreement here that meaning and purpose and relationships are very much at the core of this. And so one of the things you think about is how do we generate more opportunities for kids to have meaning and purpose? I agree with Lisa, or I'm not sure, a number of panelists may have said this, that we should, one of the things that we should do is get kids involved in other people's lives and get kids involved in causes that are larger than themselves. I'm a big believer in national service, and I think everybody should be doing national service. I think that would help. At the school level, I think we have to be much more intentional about creating relationships. So Making Caring Common has a relationship mapping strategy where we ask all the adults in the building to identify those kids they have a caring, trusting relationship with. And one of the things you find is you have a bunch of kids with a lot of stars, and then you have a bunch of kids with no stars, and that becomes the map. How do we make sure that every kid is anchored to one adult? I agree with Linda that it's not just about adults, it's also about peer relationships. And we have to be much more mindful about how to create communities in schools that are safe and inclusive, where every kid feels connected to other kids and has at least a couple of friends. And I think there are intentional strategies like advisory periods or posses or crews or things that you can do that build peer relationships. Let me stop there because I'm sure other people have.
I actually think teenagers, in my experience, feel greatly relieved when we normalize a degree of distress. When we actually say, well, of course you're going to have ups and downs, and of course you're upset, and of course you're going to have a hard day, but do it without suggesting that that somehow means they're broken or that we're worried about them or that this is, something that causes us to feel highly anxious and activated. I do worry about, if we just go to social media for a minute, there's a lot of content that I hear from teenagers about around like the that girl content or the, like this sort of like performance optimized versions of life, where you're supposed to be waking up early and having your matcha latte and doing your yoga and then accomplishing everything and crushing your to-do list. And I think on the surface can have a veneer of looking healthy and positive. And I think it leaves a lot of kids feeling completely lousy because they're just actual teenagers living actual human lives with lots of big feelings that are not all very positive. So I think the more that we can texture the conversation with and about teenagers with a recognition that they will have a lot of ups and downs and a lot of nerves and a lot of sadness. And we can meaningfully distinguish that from kids who are suffering from mental health concerns or who have experienced trauma or who warrant the full force of everything we can offer in terms of clinical intervention. I think the more we can do that, the better it is for kids regardless of where they happen to sit in that space.
I think making a plan instead of a ban is a really good kind of thing to remember, that the plan also keeps changing because they are developing. And the rules of technology and the norms and their peer life and the demands of how independent and autonomous they are as they grow up are going to change. Just like as you're teaching them how to drive, it's not a one and done talk. Just not like a sex talk where it's like a one and done sexuality. You have everything you need to know. There's all these bumps along the road, right? Oh, I didn't talk to you about that particular bump. Okay, that's another time to open up the door and have that conversation. So I would say just keep talking and understanding what is the motivation behind what they're doing online. Don't make assumptions that they're doing something that is a waste of their time. That in my studies over the past 4 years of collecting data of middle school youth, over 1,000 youth, they've always said that the number one reason why they use social media is they want to make the world a better place and they want to feel less lonely. And so there is a lot of civic engagement and a lot of really important thinking and sharing and collaborating with people online that isn't always frontline news.
What my colleagues have described is really what it means to be trauma informed. And this is what the system, because what it teaches and allows for is it allows for everyone within the system to be perpetually curious, right? So we get to ask questions, we don't have to assume. Safety is centered for everyone. And this is not a clinical intervention, by the way, it's a human intervention. And it basically says that we understand that the human condition can be fragile, but it is just as much strong as it is fragile. And there's an opportunity for us all to meaningfully co-construct the kinds of environments that we deserve to be in. So what does that look like? Quick examples. In schools, what would it look like if every student had a star hanging from when they walk in and their pictures on the star hanging from the ceiling? I'm a star. I'm seen in this place. I belong in this place. What would it look like if we took 2 minutes before class and everybody, what's up? How are you doing? Hey, it's so good to see you. Welcome. We do the Walt Disney experience. By the time I left Walt Disney, Minnie, Mickey, and everybody said, welcome. I felt welcome. But what we know is that when folks feel seen and welcome, it creates the conditions for safety and belonging that every single person. So this is not just about the adolescent. I hope that we're appreciating that it's about all the concentric circles that are attached. And then the last piece is this idea of shifting narrative powerfully and reframing. It's what I call radical reframes. It's this idea that life was never meant to be a bowl of cherries, and whoever told you that, they lied. That in this life, we all will suffer. And the real work is learning how to suffer well. Now, there is inevitable suffering, and then there's preventable, needless suffering. And the more that we teach about this to our young, developing humans, the better we all become.
Wow, thank you. And this is your chance for a Q&A. So we only have, I think, time for maybe about 3 or 4. But if you have any questions that you would like to ask directly, there are 2 mics in the aisles. So we welcome you. Yes, come on to a mic. Love to hear from you. I'll respectfully ask that you ask 1 single question and keep it to 3 seconds. But please, come on. We'll start over here.
Hi, how's it going? Sebastian.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for the talks. I wanted to ask you about transition to college and how to support adolescents through that transition. And in particular, I wanted to ask you about how do we teach adolescents about the social currency of their trauma or mental health adversities, right? So they will be writing essays, there will be letters of recommendation. These documents will explain a narrative of their adversities. And to some extent, it might be one of the first times for students to have a coherent, full story of their trauma or adversity. So how do we help teenagers navigate through that experience of having to connect their experience to larger narrative of merit.
Who wants to take that? Yeah, Lisa?
So one thing I think we can do to help with the transition to college is to make sure that students understand that it will be very stressful. And again, like I'm saying the same thing in many different ways, but it is stressful. Change is inherently stressful. This is unavoidable stress. And I think we want to be really direct and honest about that. I think the other thing I think about a lot with the transition to college is the question of college readiness. That sometimes almost always, we conflate high school graduation and college readiness. Those are two very different things. I don't know that we have systems that evaluate that very carefully. So you mentioned students who've gone through a great deal of adversity. With or without adversity, some students are college ready, some students are not college ready. And it's really a problem when students show up and they're not college ready. Things get really rough really fast. And often, I'll just say this, another year of development might be all they need to be college ready, that the interventions don't always have to be so dramatic.
I will just say two things quickly. One is that Mandy Savitz-Romer's here, and she knows a ton about this, and she teaches a course about this, so you may want to talk to
Yes.
You may want to talk to Mandy about it. And Mandy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but only about half of kids, first of all, are going to college. So, there's also an issue of just helping kids in the transition to the next step. I think we too often assume that most kids, or a great majority of kids, are going to college, and that's not true. The other thing is that I do a lot of work with the Common App. I do a lot of work on college admissions. I want to respond to the other aspect of your question, which is I think students actually have to be very careful about talking about mental health challenges in their applications. And I say that because I see their mental health challenges getting misinterpreted so much in the college admissions process. And I don't think the application process should invite kids to talk about those challenges because the risk is high. If kids want to talk about them, it's just really important to talk about them in a way that suggests that they are managing them now. That may sound cold-hearted, but that is simply the reality that we're seeing with college admissions officers.
Yeah, when you've got an open wound and it's actively bleeding, it's probably not the best time to, try to do something with that. But when you've healed a little bit, you found meaning from it, then you're able to speak about it in a very boundaried, I think, purposeful way.
Yeah.
And so maybe wait for that. Yeah, Helen?
Thank you. Thank you all so much. So my question is, how can adults support teenagers and adolescents to talk about mental health with each other? Because obviously this is going to be an ongoing conversation. And so what are action items that we as adults and educators, parents, families, what can we do to support that those conversations are happening even when we're not in the room or talking to them?
I think where it can start is around the conversation of, because I think that oftentimes what gets conflated is mental health and mental illness. Everybody should be concerned with your mental health. And so if the question is around wellness and how we maintain wellness and how we support each other in our wellness, then conversations around safety, of course. The other conversations that don't happen quite enough that I think is so interesting is fear. Right, when I say this a lot, when our framers came to Philadelphia, or the framers of the country came to Philadelphia, I believe that they went there with their greatest hopes, but what got codified in the Constitution were their greatest fears. And then if we look at all of the policies and practices thereafter, including some of the institutions that we all serve, what's codified is fear. So how do we open up the space to allow people to be curious, to be truthful, right? And to stand in their respective truths with humility, but also to express this idea that what they need in order to be safe. I don't need to make assumptions, I just ask. And once we ask and we create the opportunity for people to talk about it, it's amazing the data that comes out, right? Then that data can be used. I think I was cut off, but I don't need a mic though.
You're back.
Was that a sign to be quiet? But once that
It's
data,
not the Oscars.
it's okay, right? Exactly. The music is playing, but anyhow. But I think that that's an opportunity to use that data then to help create the space, right? The more we talk about safety and belonging, the more we create this. The more we become better at creating the conditions for safety and belonging, right? Because when was the last time somebody asked you what you needed? You don't have to answer this. Answer it in your spirit. When was the last time someone asked you what you needed in order to feel safe enough to do your job? I can tell you that I've asked that question. I work globally, internationally, and 9 out of 10 people have said to me, no one has ever asked me that in my lifetime. But yet we know that safety is a core requirement in order for any of us as human beings in order to thrive. Again, survival is a low bar. So we're talking about mental health and wellness and how we shape it. Let's start the conversation around safety.
Yeah. Can we also throw in there therapeutic conversations without therapy, right?
Right, you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic.
That's right.
Yeah.
We'll go over here.
Hi, thanks for being here today. I think the point about ensuring each child has a meaningful and deep connection with at least one adult is an important one. And so in the spirit of being at the Graduate School of Education, what does that look like at a practical level in our K through 12 school systems, especially large public school districts where, 400 kids are matched with a guidance counselor, for example. What policies or practices have you seen be effective in improving those meaningful connections?
Well, so to actually pick up on what you just said about there's a lot of things that are therapeutic that are not therapy. When we think about the harms of the pandemic, one significant factor is that kids were not seeing their coaches, seeing their after-school adults they might have hung out with, doing extracurriculars around all of these grown-ups who really have potential to be incredibly protective forces. And so when we think about mental health programming that can go into education, we should be thinking about arts, theater, all sorts of things that kids want to do, because what you're also always going to be up against is a chemistry problem. Not every kid's going to connect with every adult, right? So it's about putting enough adults in any adolescent's traffic pattern so that they find the adult who is meaningful to them. I will tell you, in a lot of schools, the security guards or the person who's at the front desk are doing more emotional heavy lifting than anyone, and that is, I think in many ways, phenomenal, right? They get kids, they like kids, they're checking in on kids, kids are stopping by and talking to them. So I think it's, we need to have as many fabulous adults as possible in the traffic patterns of teenagers. They do not need to be counselors. I mean, we need counselors, but we need to think broadly.
Yeah, I'm just going to reinforce what Lisa said. I think we need mentor-rich environments. I mean, we talk, so I was talking about relationship mapping. I think kids should be anchored to at least one adult, but we have to create mentor-rich environments. When I was talking about relationship mapping, I wasn't just talking about counselors. I was talking about teachers, athletic coaches, art teachers, the custodian, the school secretary, everybody. And I think we also need to do reverse relationship mapping, which is find out who kids actually talk to about mental health problems. And prepare those people to have those conversations. And that may not be a health ed provider, it may not be a counselor, it's often someone else in the school, to Lisa's point.
But one thing we don't talk enough about, I have a good friend of mine who does some work with the Stanford graduate, don't hiss or anything, but the Stanford Graduate School of Education. It's okay if you do. And one of the things that she says, she is working in Sacramento and is responsible for 2 million kids and families and adolescents. And she oftentimes says, if you don't love the kids, then it's okay to reevaluate what you're doing. That love piece gets so lost. And we're talking about sort of a communal type love. We have several programs and models where counselors have invited like retired persons, I'm partial. My grandmother's my best friend, right? I think that's wisdom you cannot buy. So it's how do we leverage community members and folks who love kids, just period. And we don't even have to be talking about it in the context of a mental health problem. Just love is enough. Like it covers all. Like it's healing without even speaking. So there are opportunities to invite folks in the community like retired persons to come in that actually have shown to be quite successful, especially in trauma-informed school models.
Thank you. I hate to do this, but Matt, final question.
It's terrifying when you have to stand up to ask a question.
I'm so sorry about that.
But I wanted to ask, Dr. Damore and Vice Board, you both kind of spoke a little bit about pathologization and kind of drawing the line between, kind of normal response to a crisis, then when it kind of hits that clinical threshold. And I guess I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts more on like kind of the consequences of kind of like a clinical feedback loop wherein like a student, makes contact with like the clinical system and then through that, which can be like a traumatizing experience, then kind of become a self-fulfilling prophecy where they kind of become ensnared in similar to like a school to prison pipeline almost.
We take one response for that. Yeah.
Ooh, well, now all the pressure's on me here. I think that we want young people to feel deeply supported by everyone in their environment, and it does indeed happen that the people who are supposed to be helping actually make things worse. I also think, we're talking about making distinctions between the pathological and the typical. The more that we can do education for young people about what depression looks like and how it differs from sadness, what nerves are and how they differ from pathological anxiety. And it loops back to actually another conversation we were having about teenagers talking among themselves about mental health, which they do. They actually talk about it quite a bit. And I think one of the gifts we can give them as adults is very clear lines about what we expect them to support one another with and when it's time to bring in an adult. And so being very clear that if they're hearing about depression or suicidality, if they're hearing about self-harm, if they're hearing about violent relationships, if they're hearing about eating disorder behavior, if they're hearing about anything where, it sort of crosses those lines, that's when it's time to bring the concern to a loving adult. That, for teenagers, also provides tremendous relief because they are taking such earnest care of one another, and those lines are not always made as clear to them as I think can be useful.
Gosh, I wish we had 2 more hours, but thank you so much. Can we end with maybe one word from all of you, like what you're taking, what you're feeling?
Yeah.
Just one word, and then we'll end.
Empowerment.
Empowerment.
Oh, who?
Do I have to say,
Sure,
I have to
everyone.
stick to one word?
Yeah,
Just one word.
Oh,
nuance.
Nuance.
is going to be my word.
Empowerment and nuance.
I'm going to go with love.
Love.
Hope.
Hope. Yes. For me too. Hope, I think. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Maybe our panelists want to do a selfie with the crowd?
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Well, we didn't ask permission. Do you want
Is
to
that
be
okay?
in a selfie with us?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. You want to do it?
Sure. Let's see if I can do this. Oh no, my child's camera is off because I blocked it. Somebody want to use their phone? Yeah.
Sure. Is your phone right now?
Turn around to get everybody.
Sure. Like this?
We also have our photographer here.
Oh, yes, 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 yeah.
I'd like to.
What do we got?
My phone too.
Thanks, Linda.
Okay. I appreciate our opportunity.
Well, we are happy with
For sure.
1, 2.